half-armored combat. HEMA needs more of this. I'm going to tell you why and how you can get it. Let's go. I'm Nick Thomas and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. So here I'm going to be talking about partial armors or half armors, how they are really interesting within the HEMA community and how you can get this precise set, which was made by Aegis or Aegis Armour and is an exclusive to swordshop.ca. I'll put links in the description. They're actually up for sale and you can buy them now. They're really quite affordable and that's what makes this fantastic for the HEMA community. So really, what are we talking about here? Well, a half armor or partial armor. The terms half armor are a little bit controversial because people argue as to what exactly equates to a half armor. But overall, most people say a partial or half armor covers the torso area and usually a helmet. Now, why does that sound familiar? Oh yeah. The reality is, throughout human history, it's been really common to wear some kind of torso protection and some kind of head protection. And the reason for that is it gives you enough protection over core areas without being too heavy and compromising movement and agility and marching distance, flexibility on the battlefield, all these kinds of things. Because the reality is full basically armor, okay, what you call sort of harnish fencing, and those who do it in the kind of the German school within HEMA, a full armor has a lot of problems. It's very heavy, it's very bulky, it takes a long time to get on, usually requires arming garments, like arming doublets, often people to help you get into it. It's expensive to manufacture, it realistically needs to be tailored to your body shape. It just has a lot of issues, and then you go onto a battlefield and, you know, how flexible can you be when you're wearing a full harness? Now, that isn't to say that you can't move well in a full harness, and there's been a lot of videos by some really interesting people that have dispelled myths about fully armored combat, because we've got this idea today that fully armored combat is kind of slow and cumbersome, and that's not quite true. But at the same time, let's not forget that it's a lot of metal on your body, it's a lot of weight, it's a lot of heft to lug around, and a lot of restrictions in terms of visibility once you go to full face-plated helmets as well. So within the HEMA community, most of what we practice is unarmored fencing. So we're practicing for no armor whatsoever, which means you're fighting usually in a civilian context or in certain military contexts where they didn't wear armor, which of course, as time went on, for the most part, armor tended to decrease, particularly into the late 17th century. However, there is a segment within HEMA that practices fully armoured combat, and that's quite interesting. For me, it's not as interesting as unarmoured and partial armoured, but it's a personal thing. But fully armoured combat is well detailed within historical treaties and is fascinating, but it's hugely restrictive in terms of entry costs, and for me personally, I just don't find it as fun as the kind of, you know, partially armoured and unarmoured. That doesn't detract from what fully armoured combat is. It's still awesome, and if you want to practice fully armoured combat, by all means do that. But there has been a gap within HEMA for quite some time that not many people have really been getting into or been able to get into, and that is this partially armoured or half-armoured combat. And that's what I said about what is partially or half-armoured. Well, it's kind of as it sounds, is you are partially or half-armoured. And that usually means you've got some kind of torso armour, you know, cuirass or corselet they were sometimes called, and usually a helmet, and that helmet will often be open-faced, like this Bergenet over here. So what I'm wearing here is a very common soldier's armour from the 16th century and into the early 17th as well. So you've got torso protection, you've got tassets, which can vary in length, going down to just over the kind of hip area, and sometimes they can extend a bit further down the thigh. And then we've got upper arm protection, spaulders or pauldrons, depending on how large they are. And you'd wear it usually with an open face helmet. Now, what that basically means is that you're effectively a medium kind of infantry, is you are pretty flexible. Even a light infantry, you could say, depending on exactly what role you're fulfilling, is it's enough armor to stay well protected in most scenarios, but not too much armor that it costs a fortune, is cumbersome, takes ages to get on, and makes you inflexible on the battlefield and, you know, marching to the battlefield and that kind of thing. And so that's what we're talking about. Now, also, this is a munitions grade armor is what we would call it. So when I said about full armors, they do ideally need to be tailored to the actual individual, which is why buying full armors off the shelf is a real problem. It's a real difficulty getting them to fit most people because, well, we are all differently shaped, of course. Different height, different weight, different body composition. muscle mass. It's all these things. It's hard to make an off-the-shelf armor fit. But munitions grade armors in certainly the 15th, late 15th, going to the 16th and early 17th century, munitions armor means it's cheap, simple, off the shelf, and fits basically everyone. So they will be stored in kind of like town armories within the sort of tower in London, for example. And as necessary, they're just issued out to the soldiers as military issue equipment is today, for example. So if there are a range of sizes, it's going to be a small range, maybe a couple of different sizes to fit basically everyone. So it might be one size fits all, it might be one or two or three sizes fits all, but it's not tailor-made armor and it's not expensive. It is just simple, cheap, does the job. For me, that is absolutely fascinating. I'm kind of a bit less interested in what basically a very wealthy noble can wear, even though that's cool as hell. Not going to deny it, full armors are absolutely epic. But I am absolutely fascinated in what the average soldier was using at the time, and I think that's really fascinating. And it's not just soldiers, because these were used by militias, by town guards and that kind of thing as well. So quite extensively used. I think that's fascinating, and I would like to see a lot more of it. Now, taking it into a HEMA context, what does this actually mean when we're sparring? Well, if you watch any channels about swordsmanship, you will know that steel armor stops sword blades, okay? So if you want to beat armor like this, you need something that can either concuss through, like a mace, or something like a pick or a polearm that can basically pierce, sometimes thrust, potentially with some quite tough polearms. Usually they would find gaps, find openings, and potentially smash. So if we're using this armor in a sword context, basically what we're saying is anything that's covered by steel is off target, which is realistically what it would mean if you were using sharp swords. If you beat against this armor with a sharp sword, you're much more likely to damage your sword than damage anything to do with the armor or the user beneath, okay? Because this is a rigid armor. It's not like, chainmail or mail. If you go back to, say, Viking-Saxon combat, to a degree, they could hack in with a sword against mail and do damage through it, because mail or chainmail is flexible. It's a fabric, okay? So it doesn't dissipate the energy across the space. Now, it's a bit more complex than that, because they did wear padded undergarments and stuff like that, but you get the idea. With a hard armor, okay, the energy is dissipated across the whole thing. So if a sword impacts on this armor, the very worst it would do is kind of a light dent, depending on the thickness of the armor. Far more likely, it's going to cause edge damage and potentially even shatter your sword. So hitting this armor, not a good thing. Won't do anything. And therefore, in your HEMA context, this is off target. That is a fascinating element to the fight. And of course, that means that you can wear any amount of the steel armor you want, up to kind of 3/4 armor or whatever, and you can still do your normal fencing. You just got certain areas off target, but you're paying for that price in weight, flexibility, maneuverability, that kind of thing, potentially visibility depending on the helmet you're wearing. I think that's absolutely fascinating. Now, why has this not been that common up until now? Because it's not been readily available. Off-the-shelf armors, as I said, are available, have been available for a while, and some of them are okay, some of them are terrible. And the reason for that largely is because, again, we're not all the same shape, and two, the cut is usually terrible. So if you look at the way that this is cut here, this cuts in essentially under my rib cage, which is ideally what you want, whereas most off-the-shelf armors today cut in around about the belt line. And my belt line is about 3 inches below where this armor's cutting down. And if you cut armor down to a modern, let's face it, today we wear our belts quite low, okay? If we cut it to a modern belt line, the restriction in movement is horrible. And as you duck down like this, what tends to happen is your thighs press against the folds or the lower part of the armor or tassets, potentially whichever you hit first, and it smashes you in the face here, which potentially could be absolutely horrific in terms of injuries. But more than that, it's just you can't move in it, it's not comfortable, it's pants. And you try and do lunges and you try and do passing steps, and it's just getting in the way. Off-the-shelf armors, they're a mixed bag, but most of them are pretty bad, okay? Enter this. This was designed with Jay of Swordshop.ca in collaboration with Aegis, who are actually manufacturing it, to replicate the original armors as closely as possible for a really good budget price. And I think they've achieved it, because this armor, I have very thoroughly tested it. We've got 2 sets of it, and it comes in 2 sizes. So I'm wearing the medium. Bear in mind, I'm 5'7", okay? So the large on me does just get a bit too large. And remember, length of armor, as I said, length of the torso armor is really, really important. This medium, for example, fits me fantastically, and I can move really, really well, and it works fantastically well, and we really batter the hell out of them. Now, talk about battering, you'll notice there's a big, big dent by here. Now, this was the first set that was ever manufactured from the factory, and they were too thin on the steel based on the requirements that they were supposed to make. They were supposed to make it out of 16 gauge armor, and they made it out of 18. This is an 18 gauge set. That was a hard hit from a Black Fencer steel generation broadsword. So one of the beefiest blades you're actually going to face, and that did put a good dent in it, although not a big problem. However, as I said, it wasn't intended to be this thin. So 18 gauge armor is approximately 1 millimeter thick, and this, I've used my caliper, is around about 0.9 up to about 1.1 millimeters. I think 18 gauge armor can be used for HEMA as long as you're not going too heavy. You just have to accept that it dents here and there. Of course, we're not trying to kill each other. We're not wailing in with huge heavy pole arms and maces and stuff. I think 18 gauge can be used, but I think 16 is the sweet spot. And this set here, notice my battered and rusted set that I've been heavily using, this new one is the correct 16 gauge. I haven't actually put it together yet, but I just had a good look at it. I got the caliper on, measured to see that it's all correct, and indeed that is around about 1.2, 1.3 mil. And so it's pushed the weight of the armor up to actually a good realistic range. So you'd expect an armor like this to weigh, it varies, but you'd expect it to weigh around about 7 kilos, maybe even a bit more. And that's exactly what that set weighs. That set now weighs about 7.5 kilos, which is excellent. It's what you'd expect it to weigh. So what you're getting in this set is front plate, tassets, and your arms. If I turn around, you notice we've got crossed straps on the back, nothing at the belt line, which isn't necessary if this fits correctly. Now, anybody that ever does anything with, plate carriers and chest rigs for, whether you're in the military, whether you're in airsoft or whatever else, you'll notice that if you've got all the weight on the front, it has to load bear correctly over the shoulders to feel comfortable. If you've got weight pulling on your front, it's horrible. It really pulls your back, it restricts your movement, it swings around, it's horrendous. But if it load bears correctly and the straps work correctly and it's set up correctly, everything just sits nicely and it's just comfortable. I could wear this all day. I have worn it for hours on end at sparring. It's been absolutely really comfortable. The best off-the-shelf armor that I've ever worn. Okay, and that's quite really impressive. Now, if you wanted to buy this set, it's now up for sale for 450 Canadian dollars, which for us in the UK, that works out at about £270 roughly, and you would be therefore likely paying import duties or whatever else. But, that kind of price, that's just unheard of for this much armor that fits this well. And that is vital because, let's face it, within the HEMA community, unless you're doing armoured, as in fully armoured combat, you're not going to have a lot of money to spend on steel armour. It's a nice extra. It's like when we practice side swords and rapiers and we want to get, a reteller, a steel shield, because that's a really interesting part of rapier and side sword, but it's not your core thing. You're not going to spend a fortune on it. You want to be able to do it as an extra. And if people are going to have to spend, £1,000, $1,500 or whatever else on just this armor for doing the armored element, not many people are going to do it. Let's face it. So what's happened here is Jay has created an armor which functions just like it should. It weighs and moves like it should, and is affordable, comes in 2 sizes, will be able to fit most people. This is mild steel, so you can bend it. Okay, so if you need to shape it, for example, into the side, up into the top here, you can shape it to a degree by hand or with tools to make it individually fit a little bit better for you. That's the beauty of mild steel. And of course, we're not using sharp weapons or heavy percussive weapons where we need hardened steel. You don't need hardened armor for the kind of HEMA combat that we're ever doing. It's just not necessary. A 16 gauge mild steel is fantastic for what we're doing. Right. Let's just talk about a few other elements of what this armor is. I said it's a munitions grade armor, and this style is associated with the Almain rivet style of armor that was really common in the 16th and into the early 17th century. And it's defined by a collar, as in you talk about the Almain collar, which is a gorget or gorget, which then connects to the spaulders and all overlaps and interacts and works together. And it's a beautiful construction, which means you don't need an arming garment underneath. It's simplified, it has great coverage. It's actually, as a cheap, simple armor, it's really effective, really cheap, easy to maintain, fantastic. Now, what is missing from this armor, of course, is the collar. So what happens on this armor is your pauldrons, or spaulders, are connected onto the leather straps, which go up and over and connect over at the back. From a HEMA perspective, that's why this has been developed. Remember, this is not designed to be a reenactment armor. This is a HEMA armor, and we have to deal with the protection of our jackets underneath, our actual gorgets or gorgets that we wear for HEMA, and the bib of our fencing mask and the overall mesh of our fencing mask. And if you wear an Almain collar with a fencing mask and all this jacket and stuff, it gets in the way, it's hard to get a mask on, it pushes the mask bib up, it's just a nightmare. Now, if you wanted to add an Almain collar to complete this armor exactly as it would look historically, you could add it yourself. But from a HEMA perspective, it doesn't really do anything. It's not necessary. Our jacket bibs are fulfilling much the same role, and our jacket collars. This actually functions as it should, okay? It doesn't need the collar. Same for the backplate. So munitions grade armors in the 15th and in the early 16th century often didn't have a backplate. Why? To save cost. Okay, so you just have the front. Now, as the period went on, backplates started to become more popular again. But again, munitions grade armors didn't always have them, and they're just not that important from our HEMA perspective. Okay, it's just not that big a deal. If you wanted to add a backplate, you absolutely could. There are places you can buy a backplate. But I think it's a good idea to not include it on this one. It keeps the price down. It keeps the shipping down. What do you got to carry defense in? There's less of it. There's less to maintain. There's less weight on you. It's just a whole lot easier. Okay, so if you want to add a backplate, you can. But I think as a functional off-the-shelf armor, it's not necessary, and it's just hassle. So I think that's fantastic. So I'm not worried about the backplate, and I'm not worried about the Almain collar. This has just done the set as a HEMA training set absolutely perfectly. So what we've got to say about that is this armor. Do I have any complaints? No. It took a few heavy dents because this was slightly too thin, but as I've said, it's now in the 16 gauge. Fantastic. Any complaints whatsoever? Really not at all. I will say that the straps on the initial versions were short-ish. I can get into this one, but some people, depends on obviously, you know, how big you are, you might want longer straps. But of course, if you need to extend leather straps, you just get another piece of leather and tie it through the buckle, or sorry, not through the strap, and just extend it. It's the easiest job in the world. The tiny little detail I would mention about my one is the spaulders, okay, on this medium didn't move as flexibly as the large. So with the large one, I just got the spaulders and flexed them, and they just move around like they're just soft as hell. But on this medium one, where the straps are obviously shorter and everything else, there's not quite as good a movement as on the large that Mike was wearing in this photo. That said, the moment I started using it in sparring, it felt completely normal and soft. And significantly, when they sent over the new set that was in 16 gauge, I had mentioned this feature that I'd noticed in the medium, and they fixed it. And the new medium for this one that I've just unwrapped flexes around and moves absolutely beautifully. So that's already been solved. Now, the last thing to talk about is helmets, because this kind of armor, this munitions grade armor, was basically always worn with some kind of helmet, and that was usually some kind of morion or bergenet. Those are the two most common styles. Sometimes you'll see them with armets and things like that. But anyway, the point is that normally it's an open-faced helmet of some kind that covers the top of the head and somewhere to a degree down the sides, depending on how low the morion sits or the bergenet, whatever else. An open-faced. Now you can see some options here. That helmet over there is back from my old reenactment days. That is a historically produced full-weight steel bergenet, and it's very typical of the type that you would see with the armor I'm wearing. Now, what does this look like? Well, it looks like a mask overlay for HEMA with a brim on the front, like a baseball cap brim, okay? So, on a base level, you can just put an overlay on your mask. You might already have one, a standard HEMA overlay on your mask. It does cover roughly the same area as a bergenette, and then you just say the overlay is now off target because that's armor, but the mesh that you can see and the bib, that's legitimate target. And that's going to represent it quite well. And curiously, the weight of a fencing mask with an overlay on top is usually just over 2 kilos, which is approximately the historical weight of a bergenette. So you're doing it pretty well. The only thing you're missing is the visor, and the visibility, of course, on bergenettes does cut off usually a little bit more. So enter my custom overlay. Now, I am not a professional leather worker, okay? That is not what I do, but I am a good bodger. And that is exactly what I've done here. So underneath here is a standard Spez mask overlay. And you notice I've got a Spez back of the head protector, so these are separate. And I've just got some leather pieces and I've started riveting components on. So I've added the fin, I've added the sides, and I've added the brim here, which has brought the visibility down, but also increased the protection. And it's actually fascinating to see how much that brim can be used by tilting when you're in the fight. So you see a hit coming in towards your head, even a thrust, you can tilt a little bit into it and deflect off the brim. And significantly, that's even seen in some manuals, like, for example, Adam de Breen's militia manual, where you basically brace the brim of your morion up against your shield. So that's kind of quite fascinating. And I think, although just using a plain overlay works absolutely fine if that's what you've got, if we can get this into production, and I have contacted several companies, and it's hopefully in order of making something like this, that would give us the full solution. Because ultimately, when we're fencing, we have to have something like a fencing mask underneath to protect us, our actual face and our eyes. So having the fencing mask maintaining the base protection underneath is fantastic, and an overlay fixes the problem of representing the helmet. It gives people the visual cue, gives the lack of visibility, the increase in protection, and even this fin is actually really quite fascinating in brushing aside thrust and stuff like that. So you can bodge this yourself. I've made another one out of high density foam. Hopefully we will have production options for that soon. So then, of course, this armor is your typical 16th and 17th century armor, which was used, you know, all the way through Europe and beyond. And there were similar armors used in all sorts of parts. You even see the Japanese adopting certain component parts of this to integrate within their own armor. It was actually considered quite valuable to take on kind of Renaissance period plate sections within their Japanese armor, which is absolutely awesome. So you could use this in so many different settings, and it's of course used with a lot of different weapon types. So commonly you might think of, if this was in England, for example, you know, something like this, like a basket or half basket kind of thing that you saw on the Mary Rose, some kind of side sword, some kind of rapier, polearms, montantes, you know, great swords, Zweihanders, all sorts of stuff. And for me especially, shields, rotellers. Rotellers were very commonly used with armors like this as basically a light infantry, pikes, all kinds of things. So for me, this armor has fulfilled a gap that has existed for a long time. Off-the-shelf armors, I've owned loads of them. In this photo, you can see I actually own almost all of the armors in this photo, and they've all been a bit pants, except this one. This is absolutely epic. It's just off the shelf, doing the job really, really well. Now, in terms of technique, you might ask, how do you practice partially armored combat? It's not mentioned in the manuals. Well, it doesn't need to be mentioned in the manuals, does it? Because partially armored combat is the hybrid between unarmored combat and armored combat. So we've got lots of exposed areas, exposed arms, potentially the neck, the legs, the groin, inner arms. You can see areas that can be struck as if it's an unarmored fight, and you can see areas that act like a fully armored fight. And that means that you're going to be combining those two things. Now, we know soldiers were commonly taught at the fencing schools, so they're learning exactly what you're seeing in those fencing manuals. So when you fight an armoured opponent, fight them in their unarmoured parts like an unarmoured fencer. Fight them in their armoured parts like an armoured fencer. And that means you're largely going to be fighting like an unarmoured fencer with restricted target zones, and potentially then throwing in sort of half sword in locks and stuff like that, and potentially throws as you get in close, because as you get in close there are less target areas and it might become more like an armoured fight. So you don't need manuals. We've got the systems in place to practice with these armours. It is the hybrid. It's unarmoured with restricted target zones with some aspects of armoured fighting coming into it. In conclusion, I think armored fighting or partially armored or half armored fighting like this is a fascinating subject. It looks awesome. It feels awesome. It's a really interesting aspect that we don't commonly get to see. I'd like to see a lot more of it, but it's been really hard to access up until this point. I think this set by Swordshop.ca, made by Aegis Armour, is absolutely perfect to solve this problem. The two different sizes mean it can fit the majority of people out there, and you can modify it a little bit to a degree to fit pretty much everybody, which is absolutely epic. So I would highly recommend that you go and buy this now. I know that there is stock of it. I think it works brilliantly well, and I look forward to seeing so much more of it in HEMA. That's all from me. Thanks for watching, and please do subscribe if you haven't already.